We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Gita, and in particular, two chapters where he elaborates what the Upanishad is pointing to when it speaks of eye of our eye and hearing of our hearing, that there is such a thing as a higher sense, a higher sight, a higher hearing, of which our sight, our hearing, our senses are only a reflection. And that is Brahman and not this. So we have in the discussion so far looked at the true sense of what it is to experience senses. It is not the biology, but the mind entering contact with an object and reproducing its image, which is the true sense of the senses. If mind simply enters into contact but does not take in and make an image, we still do not have a sensation. Next, Sri Aurobindo goes deeper into the psychology of this operation itself and points to four functions which are indispensable for any consciousness when it is in action, in activity. And these are the four which we had been studying the last two sessions, the names for which, according to the Upanishad, the names given are Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana, and Ajnana. Vijnana is the comprehensive consciousness which takes in the fullness of the image in its essence, its totality, its parts, its properties, and it is as if one with what it knows, and our normal functioning in the mind can only catch a very pale shadow of this freer functioning which belongs properly to the higher faculties, to the supramental consciousness. But in our human mind is organized prajnana, the faculty by which our mind places in front what we want to know and then reaches out to enter in relation and to possess by analyzing and synthesizing this separate image. Samjnana is the complementing mechanism by which it takes in this image into itself in order to identify with it and experience it in substance, feel it out as if a part of yourself, to know it more deeply, to touch it, so to say, but in identification, even if partial. And ajnana is the operation of consciousness dwelling on an image to hold, to possess, govern, and powerfully to be able to act with it, through it. Now, these four, we have seen already how they operate in the mind and in the supermind and the relationship. But these four are important for us to fully appreciate as four functions within us. And I want to elaborate on why this is important. It's not merely a philosophical idea. It's not merely an analysis one does of how the mind functions and then you move on because it was useful to analyze. Rather, these four operations are happening in us all the time, constantly. By becoming conscious of them as separate operations, we acquire a certain awareness of these operations, and in acquiring awareness, we acquire control, and in acquiring control, we can heighten, intensify, or even change and raise these functions to their higher possibilities. When we have a vocabulary for a particular experience, when we have in us an awareness, not merely a vocabulary, an experiential awareness of what the thing is, at that point, automatically, we are enriched by a new power, a new faculty, a new understanding, with which now we can develop our experience of the world more richly. As an example, you have little children who have not had certain experiences of adult life, and they know the words, but what it means has no real sense. I recently saw an example of a 5-year-old child who, this is not in India, it is in a European country, who very proudly said, I have had so far 4 boyfriends, and I was kissing this boyfriend because I liked him, but now I don't like him anymore, so I've stopped kissing him. And the parents are wondering, what is happening here? And so you interact with the child and ask, what do you mean by you were in love? She says, I was in love with that boy. So what do you mean you were in love? No, I liked him. Now, this is the best that her psychology and biology is able to understand of what she sees in adult behavior, which she is trying to imitate. But there is no sense of the reality of the experience. There is a vocabulary, but not a living identification with what that experience is. In the same way, we watch a dog. A dog sniffs a handkerchief and then follows a trail and goes to the person who owns the handkerchief. We watch it, we say, oh, the nose is so sensitive that it can smell the person. But if you think about it, there is a wind blowing, and the wind would take away the smell. And this dog is following the smell after 2 hours. What is it really following? We don't even know. We see it sniffing, so we assume it is smelling, but we have no way of what is actually happening inside the dog. But if we could experience that, if with that experience we had a vocabulary to describe that, and that we could now activize in our own consciousness, you can see how much richer suddenly life becomes. Just as this 5-year-old girl someday in another 10 years will actually experience what it feels like to experience falling in love or feeling a certain passion of emotions. And at that point, the words will have a different meaning for her. But until then, it's just a vocabulary. And in the same way, these 4 terms of Vijnana, Prajnana, Samjnana, Ajnana, okay, it's just Sanskrit words, okay, we have analyzed it. But if we can translate them internally, subjectively as a living experience, then we have tools by which we can now engage with the world more richly. We have a vocabulary to give form to certain things which do happen in us, aware of, because we never saw them as distinct. Now, in the last 2 discussions that we had, we have tried to take many examples of real life where we see these 4 terms operating in our consciousness, especially when we are learning new things. But we will review this again a 3rd time because it will help to settle in our consciousness what is actually happening in these 4 operations. So let's say you are in a room with many objects around you, and somebody points out and says, did you notice that bouquet of flowers? Your mind immediately turns to pay attention to what this is. At that point, your consciousness has placed before it an object which is separate from it, which it wants to know, it wants to enter in relation, and where now the mind instantly grasps, this is the object, this is what I want to know, and at the same time it has taken in and absorbed already the sense of the flowers, the meaning that they carry. This was a gift and it has been kept here. I don't have to think it out. I turn attention and I'm aware and it's done. And the sanjnana is the part which takes in and brings the meaning and the familiarity of contact with this. Oh yes, I received this yesterday on my birthday. This is what it means to me. So there has been a prajnana movement of placing before, a sanjnana movement of touching as if in substance, entering in contact, possessing it. And the same process, if now I apply to something totally new, which I have never seen before, which I have never held, never entered in relation with, Somebody brings before me a strange device. He places this, what looks like a screen, and then he takes a paintbrush, wets it, and then draws a pattern, and as if colors form wherever the water touches. And I say, oh, what is this? And you will see at that point, I've held a pad, I've held a brush, these are familiar to me. But now a part of my mind is trying to quickly take in, what is this? I don't have a vocabulary, I have no past association. But very quickly, I'm trying to take in, observing, standing back, oh, it takes an image, a brush movement leaves a trace, it's done by the water, a color forms, and something inside me is quickly assimilating, absorbing, and there's a movement of the prajnana and samjnana by which I am trying to organize in myself a familiarity and a deeper understanding of what this is, what it's used for, what is its best application. And it's doing what would be natural for vijnana. The vijnana by which I would have known instantly the full sense and purpose of it is now being constructed by these two functions, because vijnana is not operating in me normally. And then you will find instinctively I try to reach out and hold it and take the brush and paint myself. And at that point, I am exercising ajnana, the faculty by which I am entering in relation of power to be able to wield it, to seize it, and exercise power in it and through it. And the vijnana and ajnana faculties are partially developed. Prajnana, samjnana are the means by which I imitate the operation of vijnana and ajnana. And this is how we learn, we grow, and let's say having used this for many days, weeks, it has become so familiar, I'm not even conscious of it as a separate object. While speaking to somebody, I pick up the thing, I do what I have to do, and I don't even notice any sense of separation. It has become an instrument of my own consciousness. Like an artist who at first as a child had to struggle with colors, mixing colors, getting exactly the shade and texture that he wants. But now as a master artist, his full consciousness is on the experience he wants to express. The hands move automatically, the paints merge spontaneously, the image forms. He is not even conscious of how he wields the colors and the brushes and the instruments. At that point, the aspect of the function of vijnana and ajnana have become as complete as possible to the mind and to the body. Now I seize, I know, I possess, I am one with, in knowledge and in power, with these tools. We took last time the example of cycling, where also one goes through an initial process until it becomes a part of your consciousness and a part of your body. And so these four functions are operating in us. And these two particular, vijnana and ajnana, are not fully developed, are not spontaneously operative simply because the object that we have with which we enter in relation is fundamentally different from me. Let's say I meet now a pet dog. It is a pet of a friend. In my first contact with the dog, perhaps I have fear, I have apprehension. Then over time, as I become familiar, a relationship develops. And at some point, the relationship is so close, I can literally communicate with the dog and feel the response, the feelings, the thoughts of the dog myself. At that point, I have developed through these two powers, samjnana and prajnana, the capacity which would be natural to vijnana and ajnana, where I would walk in, feel the dog, embrace the dog in consciousness, and feel him a part of myself, and the friendship would be instantaneous. We would play as if we are one person. But there is, to begin with, a separation, and therefore these two faculties of vijnana, grasping, fully identifying in knowledge, and ajnana, identifying and wielding in power, these two are not possible to be fully exercised and spontaneously exercised. But in the portion we read last time, Sri Aurobindo is preparing us now to understand how the higher consciousness of the divine works. And he says, Supreme Consciousness, Master of the world, which conducts behind the veil all the operations of the world. What would it be like? And then he describes how its knowledge would be complete, its action would be spontaneous, and these four faculties would be merged in a single free action. And so let us dwell on this idea for a while. And we draw here an analogy. The analogy is of our own consciousness and relationship we have with our own body and our own mind, because that is ours. That is not separate from us. Although there is a separation, it is a very thin separation. I feel my hand the moment I turn my attention to know my hand. I feel my hand as a part of myself, not as the dog outside, not as this bicycle which is separate from me. I am one with my hand. And so when I turn my attention, what does my hand feel now? I'm turning internally into myself and feeling what my hand feels. And yet, in that internal turning where I am one with my hand, I am aware, I can wield it. I want to lift my hand, I lift it. I don't have to say, I order the muscle to bend so that the hand can lift. I just lift hand. What happens internally is not my concern. It responds to my will instantly. And yet, in my own consciousness, I can put my hand as an objectivized, separate form. As if when I say, what does my hand feel? I project my hand's awareness before me to see it as if separate, although it's not separate. Similarly, in my mind, let us say, we are now going to write a story. Pick a story, any story that you make up. The story is going to be of a young child who goes for a ride on a boat on the ocean. And so in your mind now, you form a story. You have a broad idea that the child is going to go exploring. He will look at the fish and he will see some dolphins, he will see some birds, he will communicate with them. Very simple story. Now in your mind I ask you, what does the child feel? And automatically your consciousness objectivizes the child, placing it before you. Your attention now goes on the child, not on the bird, not on the story. And then a part of you identifies from inside the child and feels what would the child feel when it looks at the bird. And where is all this taking place? Inside you. So there is an operation where you are one with the child, well, because you are the child. The child is your own projection. And yet you objectivize and then enter in and identify and then look through the child's eyes at the bird or at the dolphin and then try to feel what would the child feel. In other words, what are you feeling when you are in the child's place on the boat in relation to the dolphin? But the whole thing is given a separation in projection. Although within yourself always. So it's of my supreme consciousness experiences in relation to the whole world. The whole universe is manifested, put out, srishta, spread out into multiplicity out of his own consciousness, in his own consciousness. It's all happening within the oneness of the divine consciousness, because there is nothing other, there is nothing outside, there is no concept of outside, there is only divine consciousness. There is no sense of space or time, there is only one awareness. And in that one awareness now, all these possibilities of the child, the boat, the birds, the dolphin, the ocean, and as they are spread out, it is as if the relationships between all these different parts are extended, and in between gaps are being filled with things. Between the dolphin and the child is the boat and the water. And as they spread out more, there are other dolphins, other fish, and more water, and waves, and ripples. You can go on filling unendingly all the rich detail you want in between, until the whole universe spreads into infinite variations of infinite objects, into an infinity of a subjective sense of space and time. So to the divine, there is no space and time in that highest station. There is only one consciousness in which all these possibilities are held. And yet the divine consciousness can now focus specially on this one child. And from the child's eyes look at the whole world and all the pieces now separate and experience the sense of distance, of space. Experience the unfoldment of things as time. You come back to the original supreme consciousness. There is no time, there is only consciousness holding infinite possibility. You are as if outside space-time. Space-time is like a dream, a vision, an imagination which you create in your own consciousness, like the artist or the playwright who is creating the story in his own mind. But the moment you focus, you enter and you have a different experience. And so here we see the Vijnana power first. Everything is in me in a single one image knowing consciousness, which knows things in their essence. I know essentially what it is. I know essentially what bone is. It knows equally in totality. The child I know because of his arms and legs and head and all the parts, as with the dolphin or the boat. And then the special parts, the arm of the child, and I can focus separately on it. And the properties of those arms, the thumb will go against the other fingers. All of these are held. In the dolphin, there will not be fingers. There will not be the capacity of the thumb to go against fingers. There will only be flippers which can push and rotate, and a tail which can move to push. And all of these are there, held simultaneously. I make it by putting special function now of the prajnana. I put in myself in front of me the dolphin. Highlight, amplify a part, the flippers of the dolphin. And then there is the faculty of samjnana, by which I take in the flipper experience. It will move like this, it will push like this. It will not have the power to grasp. It will only have the power to push around and move around the water and against the water. And then the will entering this ajnana, which holds, governs, possesses those flippers and moves them as the dolphin moves, and moves the body in these undulating movements and swims around the water. I, as that supreme creative consciousness, enter into the dolphin with this power of samjnana, with the power of prajnana, samjnana and jnana, which makes for the mastery in the action. All this is held inside the Vijnanam, which holds everything in its unity. Now this is replicated in us when we become conscious of our own thoughts or our own body sensations. But it is replicated with an indirection. After all, our body still is made up of separate parts. In that original consciousness, supreme consciousness, there are no separate parts. There is one indivisible awareness. So the closest we have to this experience is when we are daydreaming. We have one mind awareness, indivisible, at least at that moment. And in that indivisible awareness, we can dream everything we want. But we are still stuck in the experience of time. Yesterday's dream is different from today's dream. But that supreme consciousness, it is above time, remember, it's all simultaneously present. All possibilities of all things are there right now, and there is only one eternal now. In that now, I can enter by the power of samjnana, by the power of prajnana and samjnana, where I separate out certain possibilities and sequence them to create a sense of time. Just as we, in our imagination, when we are writing a story, a novel, we enter into the sequence of chain of events. We create an odd situation, and then we say that I must prepare for this. We jump back in time, create a situation which now prepares us for this outcome. And we can go back and forth easily in our imagination, in our novel, until the whole novel is perfectly cast. The Supreme Consciousness similarly has full awareness across past, present, future, can arrange things perfectly, but it does not take time to arrange them. It sees and in a single vision arranges perfectly. That creative power of arranging is what we call supermind, supramental consciousness, which puts order out of chaos. But in a single vision, and again we are reminded of the line from the Isha Upanishad, which says, Kavir Manishi Paribhu Swayambhu, the seer, the thinker, the one who becomes everywhere. So there is this seeing, arranging, placing perfectly in order, and then the thinking out, elaborations of the details. The self-existent has ordered objects perfectly according to their nature from years and eternal. From the beginning, the order has been put and arranged perfectly. And so this is a consciousness which is fundamentally different from our mental consciousness. In our mind, because we are now in divided consciousness and in space and time, we can imitate some of those things, and that's why Sri Aurobindo says, if we had like that consciousness, if we had all those four functions acting in us with the unified rapidity with which the prajnana and samjnana act, we should then have in our notation of time some inadequate image of the unity of the supreme action of the supreme energy. So as a thinker, as a dreamer, as a creator of this novel or play, I have the closest equivalent to that experience. But still it's only a distant glimpse. And it is a worthy theme of meditation to dwell on what would that supreme consciousness be like, how would it relate to the universe, in what way does it see and experience all this multiplicity of space and time from its supreme station above space and time. Literally, a part of your mind's consciousness leans towards that and begins to glimpse what that is like. And in so doing, this part of the mind consciousness opens up to a higher, intuitive, experiential glimpse of that. And it is in this way that one can enter in relation with this higher state of consciousness and then even enter it and experience it. So, now with this background, Sri Aurobindo has prepared us to recognize something very important. All of our discussions of how the human mind works and how the senses operate have prepared us now to recognize that mind of our mind and that sense of our sense, because he sees, he senses, he hears in his consciousness through these four functions. That sense of our sense are fundamental from our sense. And this is the point which we are being led to. But now we understand in what way they are fundamentally different. The supreme consciousness must not only comprehend and possess in its conscious being the images of things which it creates as its self-expression, but it must place them before it, always in its own being, not externally, and have a certain relation with them by the two terms of apprehensive consciousness. So I have created in my imagination, in my mind, this beautiful novel of the child on the boat, and I have to place in the process the child, the boat, the dolphin, the ocean in front of me, but it's not in a physical separation, it's happening in my own consciousness. And this is what it does. And it uses those two powers, prajnana and samjnana. Otherwise, the universe would not take the form that it has for us. For we only reflect in the terms of our organization the movements of the supreme energy. We are literally experiencing his experience of sanjnana and of prajnana. He places the dolphin before him and sees the dolphin through the eyes of the child. We are that child as we look at the dolphin. And this is another very useful theme for meditation. You sit down on the beach, watch the waves, or you sit in the garden, watch the plants and the flowers, and become conscious Who is it that sees? Who is it that enjoys? Who is it that appreciates? And being conscious that you who think you are conscious and enjoying are a piece, a fragment of his consciousness, who is the one who is seeing and enjoying. Except that right now he is seeing these flowers through these eyes, through those eyes, through those eyes, through the eyes of the bees, through the eyes of the rabbit, through the sensations of the trees and their leaves, and he is seeing the same flowers from all directions, in every possible way, from every molecule of air, from every butterfly flying, and also from me. That totality is his seeing. My sight is only a piece, a part of that totality of his vision. And you think of it this way, and you meditate on this idea, your seeing is only his seeing, and a part of his seeing which you share. In the part that you identify with his consciousness, in the piece which feels yourself separate, you experience this limited seeing. And the enjoyment which you have when you look at the beautiful flower is only the variety of his enjoyment, which he is enjoying from every single perspective of every single atom of the universe, from every creature, from every object, from every being. And he is already enjoying it. Of his total enjoyment from the whole universe itself to these flowers, my enjoyment is a part, in the part of consciousness that I identify with him. And when you meditate like this, bit by bit, you let go of your sense of separateness, and your consciousness now begins to turn to this vast presence of the divine. And you meditate on that, and you begin to enjoy the from an enveloping consciousness. It's as if you let go of this narrow identification with who I am and begin to participate partially, but in his, the Lord's larger enjoyment, and you forget yourself. But you also experience in that how much more complete, how much more joyous, free and clear the enjoyment becomes of these flowers. And finally, you experience what he experiences from within the flower as he enjoys the flowers from inside them. And you experience that also. To whatever extent separated consciousness can lose its sense of separation and recover the fullness of that enjoyment. And these are very beautiful experiences, and they open us as a first glimpse, a first gateway, a first window to the sense of the divine enjoyment and what it is like. And so our universe has this form where we can stand in separation and observe by the power of some prajnana and samjnana, because he places things before him in this way, in his own creative imagination. And so we are only a reflection in terms of our organization, of his action, of his supreme energy. But by the very fact that the images of things are held in front of an apprehending consciousness, within the comprehending conscious being, and not externalized as in our individual mind, as our individual mind externalizes them, the supreme mind and supreme sense will be something quite different from our mentality and our forms of sensation. So our mentality sees separately the flower, our senses see separately from far, but to him, because the whole thing is taking place within his one consciousness, it will be a very different mind, very different sensation. And we have got a glimpse of this in this meditation, when we see from all directions, experience from all directions, from all possible relationships from each object in the universe. Even from the farthest galaxy, he enjoys the sense of distance to these flowers, as he enjoys most intimately from within the flowers their relationship with themselves and with the whole universe. And that's his vision, that's his sense, that's his hearing. And so it's totally different. And even what we conceive in this way in a meditation or in a visualization is only a glimpse of his totality. He says, they his mind and his supreme sense. They will be terms of an entire knowledge and self-possession, and not terms of an ignorance and limitation which strives to know and possess. The human being always separate, we are striving to know, striving to possess, always not knowing, always in doubt, always insufficient, always limited. To his consciousness, it is always entire knowledge, an entire possession of himself. It is self-possession and self-knowledge, which is always his theme. Now, this being the great difference between our experience and his experience, the Kena Upanishad is still pointing to something more subtle. It's not enough that he is sense of our sense. The Kena says he is sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing. So it's pointing to a differentiation which is very important. Sri Aurobindo will take up this next. So he prepares us for this discussion. In its essential and general term, our sense must reflect and be the creation of this supreme sense. So the supreme sense is the only true sense. Our sense being a part of it must in its general sense be a reflection, but also in its essential sense. What is sight? What do you experience in sight? Is a reflection of his experience of sight. But the Upanishads of a sight behind our sight and a hearing behind our hearing, not in a general terms of a sense behind a sense. Certainly, eye and ear are only taken as typical of the senses and are chosen because they are the highest and subtlest of them all. But still, the differentiation of sense which forms part of our mentality is evidently held to correspond with the differentiation kind in the supreme sense also. So what the Upanishad is pointing to, because it says eyes and hearing, it is suggesting that in the supreme sense there is a differentiation of seeing and hearing, which then reflects in us as a differentiation of seeing and hearing. And this is a very important idea. We would not have thought of it normally had we just read the Kena Upanishad casually. But Sri Aurobindo points, it doesn't say sense of our sense, it says sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing. Why does it pick these two? Sri Aurobindo's commentary is obvious. He says these are the most refined. We have smell, we have taste, we have touch, but they don't have anywhere near the subtlety, the swiftness, the comprehensiveness, the freedom from time and space that our sight and hearing have. Touch, for example, is here and now. You cannot something which is 10 centimeters away, much less 10 kilometers away. But with sight, you can see not only what is 10 centimeters away, you can see something which is 10 kilometers away. You can see things which are billions of light years away as a spot, a dot in the sky, which is the star. And you are seeing not the star as it is today, you see it as it was a billion ago, because it has taken a billion years for the light to reach you here. But you can't do that with touch. You can't do that with taste or smell. The rich detail which your sight and your hearing have, similarly, you do not have anywhere near close the rich detail in your taste and smell. Perhaps the dog has that, but we don't have it. We don't have it in our touch. In fact, our touch is so poor, if you put a bead in between, you will feel as if you're touching two beads. The senses are not sufficiently developed to recognize that you're touching only one. This is a game we used to play as children. Because the hands are crossed, the senses are not developed enough to differentiate. Try, for example, on your foot, to differentiate in sensation two different spots on your foot, spread out 5 centimeters apart. You cannot differentiate. It's a blur. In your hand, perhaps you can differentiate more easily because this is more developed as a sensation. On the back, you can touch 2 points, they will feel like one, even though they're separated by a centimeter. That's how poor the touch of sensation is, the sensation of touch is, or smell, or taste. But with hearing, You can listen to a recording of a 200-piece orchestra. And if you pay careful attention, you can differentiate one instrument from another, although they are both following exactly the same rhythm of notes. You can listen in the middle of a crowded gathering where people are talking loudly among each other. You can tune in your attention to one single person's voice and pay attention to what they are saying. It is as if the sense is able to eliminate all other sounds and voices and pick out this one person and one person's voice and understand. Filtering through all the clutter of the junk of the sounds, which are all coming in a single wave. It's one ripple like this, and out of that you're able to separate it out one single voice. It is incredible. With the sight, you have the greatest in the human being, the greatest development, where they find recently, our eyes can detect a single photon, a single particle of light entering the eyes, we will be able to notice it. And that's the lowest that you could go in physical possibility, because you are not able to split the photon into two. It is the single particle of light which you are able to catch. And then so much more with the full richness of the colors and ranges. And so these two senses represent for us the highest and subtlest development. And so the Upanishad picks both. And remember, the Upanishads never waste words. They could have simply said sense of our sense, perception of our perception. Or they could have taken one example and said sight of our sight to represent all senses. But they take trouble to have an entire separate verse to say hearing of our hearing. And that means the differentiation between sight and hearing is extremely important, enough to have an entire repetitive verse repeating exactly the same thing for sight, but for hearing. When the text simply says, that which hears not with the ear, that by which the ear's hearing is heard, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after hear. So there is behind our hearing some consciousness and some hearing of that consciousness which is in the Brahman. Follow that hearing, not this which men follow after hear. So Sri Aurobindo says, this differentiation in our consciousness corresponds to some differentiation in that supreme consciousness. That's what the Kena is pointing to. How is this possible? Sri Aurobindo asks. It is what we have next to unravel by examining the nature and source of the functioning of the separate senses in ourselves. So we can't start by exploring Brahman consciousness, we don't have it. We can start by exploring our sensory consciousness. After all, we have seen all sense is mind entering in relation to object and forming an image of the object. So what is in our mind which makes us see or makes us hear as a different experience? Why is it that we don't simply experience mind, sensed this, finished? We have mind, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. 5 operations. Why is that so? And this we can investigate because it is within our psychology in identification. Their source in our mentality, and not merely their functioning in the actual terms of our life energy and our body. So we should not stop by saying, all right, we differentiate, the brain has a passage going to the ears, another passage going to the eyes operate this way, ear operates this way. So he says it's not the life energy and body difference. It's happening in our mind. Because in my mind, I can close my eyes, cover my ears, and in my mind I can enter this child who is sitting on the boat and looking at the dolphin and listening to the sounds the dolphin makes. So in my mind's perception, I can see and I can hear, and they're completely different. When the dolphin makes a sound, I do not see the sound. When the dolphin appears before me, I do not hear the vision. They're different operations. And so if we introspect in our own consciousness and see what makes essentially for the mind to see, not the biology, and for the mind to hear, then we will get a clue what is it in the Supreme Consciousness which differentiates seeing from hearing? So Sri Aurobindo concludes this chapter with this question. What is it in mind that is fundamental to sight and hearing? Why do we see and hear and not simply sense with the mind? And now we open to chapter 9, which discusses this. And this is a fascinating discussion because he goes to the very root of why we have five senses. And we will see they correspond to the five elements and the elemental conditions and their operations which are taking place in the Brahman consciousness. But then, here's the interesting thing. Sri Aurobindo makes a suggestion in passing. I'm anticipating because we will enjoy this more next Sunday. But he makes a suggestion in passing that perhaps, according to one of the Upanishads, it is suggested that there are actually 7 senses, not 5. And I have another text where Sri Aurobindo is asked this question about 5 senses, and he again there discusses why it could be that there are 7. Only 5 are developed so far, but there are 2 more which are undeveloped in us, but which are there in potentiality, which will be developed in the future perhaps. So the whole chapter is quite fascinating. We can read the first paragraph, which only prepares us for the deeper discussion. Now remember, the whole focus is going to be the mind, not the biology, not the energy of prana moving between the ears and eyes. So the full focus comes to mind. And now we turn to a deeper psychology. Mind was called by Indian psychologists the 11th and ranks as the supreme sense. Why 11th? He'll explain. In the ancient arrangement of the senses, 5 of knowledge and 5 of action, it was the 6th of the organs of knowledge and at the same time the 6th of the organs of action. So this is the Indian psychology, which goes much deeper than the current Western psychology. Indian psychology described 5 senses of knowledge and 5 senses of action, making for 10 senses, and then an 11th, which is the mind, and it is the supreme of all these 10 senses. If you think about the nature of the senses, the 5 senses, of course we know the senses of knowledge. Our consciousness inhabiting the body reaches out through the body organs, sees, hears, smells, tastes, touches. Observe carefully, in the physiological working, they tend to blur. All of them come to the brain as signals in the nervous system. So if you took the signals coming from the hearing and plugged it into the part of the brain which gets signals from the sight, then you'll get signals coming and you'll start seeing sounds. So in the biology, there is a separation which you can play around with. And there are people who, because of some illness, they get this cross connection and they see sounds and they hear pictures and things like that. But it is considered abnormal. But the 5 channels, still going deeper into the biology of it, when you smell, there is a point of contact. It's as if the molecules floating in the air touch the nose, enter, are absorbed through the mucous membrane into some sensors. There's a point of contact. Unless there's a touch, you do not smell. Similarly with the taste, well, you have to have touch. If your tongue does not touch, you do not taste. Even with the breathing, you're touching air, but you have to touch. So taste, smell and touch, you could as if blend into one. The tongue is only a specialized skin organ which is less specialized in the hands, less sensitive in the hands. In the sight, similarly, light from afar has to enter, has to be focused, and then it has to touch the retina to create an effect. Unless light touches the retina, you do not see. And the retina itself is a skin, a specialized skin. And the hearing? The air vibrating touches the eardrum, which is a thin membrane, thin skin stretched out, which vibrates and which registers therefore through a still longer process of translation. Inside there's a whole passage where there are fine hairs which also catch the vibrations of different frequencies, mapping out the frequencies along a curving path which sends signals separately. And again there is a touch. So all five senses you could reduce to touch finally, isn't it? But that's the biological working. And yet the subjective experience of seeing is completely different from hearing, which is completely different from smell, taste or touch. And so the real sense is in mind. The real differentiation of the five is in the mind. Although biology has specialized skin organs, actually it's all the same. It's specialized skin surface, registering slightly different things, but they all merge into the brain through the same passages of nervous system. In fact, if we make effort to develop, and this can be tested, you can try this out, a little bit of exercise is needed. With your finger, it is found, your skin on the surface of the finger is actually sensitive to light. And some people, after a little bit of training, can even sense difference in color by just rubbing their finger on top of a sheet of paper which has marks of different colors. You can sense something. And this shows you that although the biology is the same, the true seer through the biology is the mental consciousness. It is using the nervous system and physiological organs only as a way of projecting itself into the material vibration of things. So these are five senses of knowledge. And then five senses of action. Of these, we categorize them as hands, legs, speech, evacuation and procreation. Again, you could do specializations. You could say, well, the thumb is different from finger. No, the idea here is not so much differentiation of biology. Well, you can click your teeth and make sounds different from speech. You can clap your hand and make sounds. Why is it not a separate sense of action? You can lift, you can throw, you could call it a different sense. No. The psychology here is much deeper. It is not looking at the biology or the energy only. It is looking at what is the essential relationship of action in the world. We are able to reach out to manipulate things, move a rock from here to there. Throwing is only a specialized function of movement. Your consciousness, suppose it was just a bundle of consciousness, you have projected yourself as a mind on earth. And now you are here as a mind consciousness. You look around with your mind senses. You see rocks. You want now to see what is under this rock. You want to act upon the rock to move and to lift it. How do you do? You need some translating device into physical matter. And so there is a whole action of translation to reach out, now through the hands, to lift the rock and move it. The details of the fingers are not. It's the reaching out to move an object. The second thing is, being now in a physical body, you want to move yourself, change your position, move around elsewhere. And so the feet are your locomotion. Whether you're 4 feet or 2 feet is irrelevant here. It is the act of being able to move around, locomotion proper, as distinct from manipulation. So there are two very different functions of the mind's attempt to relate to the physical world. Speech, similarly, is an attempt to communicate with something else. So whether I do it with hands as sign language or through the mouth, or is irrelevant. It is the act of reaching out to express knowledge and transmit it to another material form. That is the sense of the speech as an organ of action. The evacuation, similarly, you could say, I pass urine or I pass stools. What about food? I am taking in, isn't it? So the whole idea here is interchange with material, where your material is entering in relation with the universal material and nourishing itself and expelling waste, and there is an interchange, throwing out, taking in is a variation of that. So that is a fourth category of action, which the mind acts on things. And the fifth, procreation, or you could say it is only pushing out some material, some tissue or some substance. No, it's not that. In terms of the pure consciousness, it is a projection of a part of your consciousness which separates and now becomes a separate entity. Your biology forms a substance in itself. That substance now separates and becomes another person. Literally, what you see in the amoeba, a part of the amoeba breaks away and becomes two amoebas, is what is happening at a macroscopic level through a much more complex process, because it's a more complex form. But really it's a real throwing out of a part of yourself to become a new person, two of you. And so these are distinct functions. The precise biological mechanism is irrelevant. It is mind projecting itself to form a new mind separate from itself. Now this principle you can now see, remove the biology and observe all these five, as we did for the five senses of the knowledge, five senses of action in mind. Mind is able to reach out to rearrange environment, is able to move itself around within the environment, is able to communicate with things in the environment, is able to interchange, absorb things and throw out things, and is able to project itself to become a new mind separate from itself. When a teacher teaches a student and awakens her own capacity, it is also a form of procreation in the mind. That is why we have the term in the Sanskrit language, Manasa Putra, mental child. And you say somebody is a Manasa Putra when literally they become an exemplar of the first, now taking a new separate form. And then of course once they have a separate form, they develop their own specialization. But first it's literally a projection, the mind forming another unit of itself. So now we look at these organs of knowledge and organs of action, and we see them purely in terms of the consciousness and the mental consciousness. And you can see they are all specialized actions, functions of the one organ of knowledge, the one organ of action, which is mind. So we do not have mind as separate organ of knowledge and mind. It is one mind, which is both knowledge and action, and therefore the 11th sense. And therefore also the supreme sense, because it is the one sense out of which all the other senses are specializations. It is a commonplace of psychology that the effective functioning of the senses of knowledge is inoperative without the assistance of the mind. The eye may see, the ear may hear, all the senses may act, but if the mind pays no attention, the man has not heard, felt, touched, or tasted. When we are asleep, all these things are happening. You're tasting at the very least your own saliva, isn't it? You're hearing at the very least your own heartbeats and the blood pulsing inside your veins. You're seeing at the very least whatever image is formed through the eyelids. Even if there's a slight light up there, it goes through the eyelids, some image forms, but you're not aware of anything. And therefore you have not seen, heard, tasted, etc. Similarly, according to psychology, the organs of action act only by the force of the mind operated as will. So if in this dream my teeth are clattering, sometimes people grind their teeth, I am not speaking, because it's not speech. Or if the words are speaking, I am not conscious, and therefore it's not speech that I am communicating. Or if the feet move or the hands move, it's not really a sense operating. Or physiologically, by the reactive nervous force within the brain. So either it's the mind's will, or in the physiology it's the nervous force working, pushing, from the brain, which must be, according to materialistic notions, the true self and essence of all will. So if you say we are brain and body, then it is your brain which is your true self and the essence of all will. In any case, the senses, or all senses, if there are other than 10, according to a text in the Upanishad, there should be at least 14, 7 and 7. All senses appear to be only organizations, functionings, instrumentations of the mind consciousness, devices which it has formed in the course of its evolution in living matter. And this is what it appears. So it's a complex sentence, many important ideas. The first idea is that it looks like that these are all special devices that living matter has evolved. But you could ask, why is it all the creatures have the same? Oh yeah, we came from the ape, therefore we have the same. We came from the previous creature and so on. But we will see shortly, and as we've already discussed, for the mind these 5 are distinct. But why they are distinct, we will go to something still deeper. And then he says, if there are other than 10, and whenever Sri Aurobindo says something like this, even as a suggestion, it is to point to a greater truth for which we are not yet ready. And then he points to authority. It's not just he saying, according to a text in the Upanishad, there should be at least 14, 7 and 7. And yet all appear to be organizations, functionings, implementations of the mind consciousness. Now why is this 7? Why 14? And what would this imply? So we'll close with this idea and we will explore the actual text of the 7 and 14 story later, next time. But it only implies one thing, that just as we can in our mind visualize the interaction with the dolphin through speech, sound, through sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, there could be other ways of sensing the dolphin. 2 more. Corresponding to some special function there inherent in our mental consciousness and which has its origin in still higher consciousness. What that is, accessible to us. But we could conceive of things. So I had read one person by the name of Ingo Swann, who was a remote viewer, very famous person. He had the ability to project his consciousness anywhere and see and touch and smell and taste anything. And the military in the US used him for spying, and he even projected himself on the moon, on Jupiter, on Mercury, if I'm right, and described things long before the confirmed what he described. And he would literally feel himself standing on Jupiter, and he would feel the ground, and he said it was semi-soft and yet very dense fluid. And later the crafts confirmed it was metallized hydrogen. Because of the immense pressure, hydrogen becomes metallic. So it is almost metallic in its rigidity, and yet it's fluid because it is gas which has been compressed. And then on the distance, he saw hills, mountains, even measured their height. And they said at that point, this is impossible. Jupiter is primarily gaseous. There cannot be mountains, which later was confirmed by the crafts. He looked up and he saw a ring around Jupiter. He described what looked like a band of crystalline, shining, gleaming, diamond-like sparkling objects, which again the craft confirmed, and so on. But he is literally there in mental consciousness and seeing with 5 senses. This man, when he wrote about the senses, he said, you know, we are foolish to say we have only 5 senses. He made a list of at least 20, including, he said, if you see magnetic fields, it would be a different sense. If you see heat, it would be a different sense. If you saw electricity, it would be a different experience of sense. Because you're not sensing with sight a magnetic field, you're not seeing the magnetic field, you're not touching it, and yet it includes all these. And it's a different experience. Because in his experience, when projecting himself in this way, in the mental consciousness, And he was asked to do this, to spy on certain Soviet facilities. He was asked to observe certain experiments where they were using particle beams. And the description I have read is not from him, but from somebody else, describes how he could see like a beam of light with particles sparkling, moving around. And it was as if his hand began to glow. Of course, it was hand of the subtle body. Began to glow in strange ways. When he put his head inside, he began to see in multiple forms some very strange experiences which he had difficulty describing. But there can be a very different way of sensing which is natural to the mind, for which the biological organs are not yet developed. We are not able to see magnetic fields. But if we could, we would experience it differently. A dolphin, similarly, has a different way of sensing with sound. And so when you stand in the swimming pool, the dolphin looks at you with its eyes, but then here on the forehead, it has a special lens. It makes a sound in its throat, and through the lens, it projects the vibration of the sound. And like a lens of our eyes which can focus and tune in, this lens is of our sound. It's a fatty tissue which changes shape and focuses the beam of sound. It can beam it to you, and you are in the water, so it beams a sound all through your body as if you're scanning, like a CAT scan or MRI scan, scanning you. Because it is sound, it penetrates through from all the tissue. So from the skin there's a reflection, from fatty tissue there's a reflection, from muscle there's a reflection, from bone there's a reflection, and if there's any variation of density in the bone or muscle, there's a different reflection. So the dolphin, as it is scanning you, is seeing you in 3 dimensions. Through the reflection of sound, it forms an image of you and sees through sound. And because the quality of the reflection varies with the density and the texture, it is also like touching. This is harder, this is softer. It is seeing through sound and touching through sound and feeling something, perhaps even close to tasting, because each texture will have its own particular scattering, which would be like a taste. And this you could put as a completely different sense. In identification with the other, though the link point is sound, our mind similarly could project itself in principle in somebody and feel from inside what the person feels like. Could it be described in a separate sense? I'm just sharing these as speculations, as indications of a possibility that beyond these 5 there could be something more. Although we're still describing the dolphin's experience in terms of the 5 senses. It is seeing in 3 dimensions, it is hearing in 3 dimensions, it is tasting or touching in 3 dimensions. But the experience itself could be fundamentally different from the 5. Perhaps. We don't know. An experience of identification in tissue and texture and feeling from inside perhaps is felt as a separate sense. And so I leave this as speculative and as indicative of a possibility. And Sri Aurobindo is pointing to this here explicitly by saying, if there are other than 10, according to a text in the Upanishad, there should be at least 14, 7 and 7. We could similarly speculate on what would be the 2 other means of action. Because we have the organs, 5 organs of action, and there should be 2 more organs of action. What could they be like? And we could speculate. And one such, again going back to the example of Ingo Swann, when first he was tested by the military, one of the experiments he was doing was, they would put a resistor, an electronic component passing electricity through it, and then he would concentrate on it and heat it up. And another object, he could heat it up, or he could move it. There were others like Uri Geller who were famous for bending spoons without touching, just by looking at them or thinking of them. Does this indicate another kind of sense of action, direction of further possibilities? So this being the first base of our description of the senses, he says, it looks as if all these senses are only organizations, functionings and instrumentations of the mind consciousness, devices which it has formed in the course of its evolution in living matter. Since mind had a need to operate and perceive in this way, it created special senses to allow it to do it through the biology. That's all. But they are therefore impulses and needs within the mind's functioning. And this is the conclusion we come to. And we will continue this next time, where he will describe how the mind we are conscious is also only a small part of a larger operation of mind. And so these senses also have their representation in this larger operation of mind. And then he will take us to that mind of our mind and why it has 5 senses, or eventually 7. So you see how fascinating this whole thing is, only because Sri Aurobindo goes to the heart and catches all the nuances of what the Kena Upanishad is showing us. It is as if the Rishi, in a broad stroke, said, look at this. And there's a whole experience which is pegged through these brief verses indicating, pointing to something. And we are required to meditate on them and go deeper into those indications and find what the Rishi wants. And in pointing to these 3 pegs or more pegs of each verse, there is a completeness, a full experience that the Rishi is opening us to in sequence. So you glimpse this, which prepares you for the next, which prepares you for the next. And in this way, a full experience is perceived and then formed in us and becomes eventually a realization. And that is the intent of the Kena Upanishad. And that is the manner in which Sri Aurobindo gradually leads us into it. We can meditate for 2 minutes. So he will, the question is it the same as supramental senses? That higher sense of our sense will be the supramental sense. But even that has 4 levels of working. Sri Aurobindo discusses those in the Synthesis of Yoga. There's a level which is above space-time. There's a level which enters space-time but sees the whole span of space separately. There's a level where it enters within the identification with space-time and the flow of things. And finally, there's a level where it identifies with a single object and sees through that. That's the sense that we have. But there are 3 other levels at which the supramental can act simultaneously.